Good morning, Drew. How are you?
Hi, Lesley. How are you?
I'm fine. It's very nice to meet you.
You too.
And very good of you, especially at this time of the morning, very good of you to moderate for us.
No problem at all.
Would you mind if I just tested my share screen?
Yeah, go ahead.
So you've made us all co-hosts?
I don't know. Kai, is that something you do or do I do that?
Yes, I'm working on it right now, actually.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, fine. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Kai. Hi, Marie.
Hey, Drew.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, same. How are you doing?
I'm okay.
Good.
Oh.
Do people mind if I'm having a cigarette before it starts? That's a very French thing to do, to be honest.
Great t-shirt, by the way, Drew.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I have a To the Lighthouse one someplace.
Well, we don't cite either. Of course, we do Flush. I am disappointed you are not wearing a Flush t-shirt, I've got to say. Not that I have one, but
I've never seen a Flush t-shirt.
neither have I.
Lesley, you'll have to talk to this guy Ali Case, who is from England. He's a grad student doing a lot of work on Flush.
Oh, great.
Yeah, he's very jazzed about that people are working on Flush again.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, Marie-Christine and I, found when this is, as you know, part of a book project. And, I had read Flush, in the mists of time as a grad student. And I must admit at the time, didn't particularly get it, this was a long time ago, but I studied with Susan Dick, who had a sense of humor, but had no interest in Flush. So we just kind of skated right over it. So coming back to it all these years later, I thought, this is exceptional. Yeah.
It's really good.
It is.
And thanks to Ollie, I dragged out my old American hardcover.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm having a book lust moment, I've got to say.
Yeah. It has these lovely Vanessa end papers.
Which I've only seen. We're going to be showing those two drawings.
Yeah.
But, oh, what a treasure.
Yeah, they're pretty. I don't even remember where I got this. Is this a first edition? It might be. Yeah, it is.
So it's your retirement fund.
On the inside, someone wrote 35 cents. I did not pay 35 cents for it.
Wow.
But someone did. One day.
And of course, not only do we love these books as fetish items, but there are always material aspects of the books, that come into play. Mrs. Dalloway, for example, I didn't know until I read an article about it that whereas the British edition has 12 sections, for the 12 hours, the American edition only has 10.
Yes.
Those kinds of things, or when you talk with people who've never seen the photographs for Three Guineas because their edition didn't have them.
Right. And also the weirdness of that there are two versions of To the Lighthouse as well.
Yeah, exactly.
That she corrected proofs. Different sets of proofs for different grades.
I know. I mean, completely understandable if you're that kind of busy. But of course, to us, we're thinking, oh, how could that be? But of course, it gives us things to talk about.
Well, and what's the authoritative version of the text?
And what do we do when there isn't one?
Right.
And here is Marie-Christine joining us.
All right.
So we're all set. Kai, could we share our screens now?
Yes, you should be able to.
Okay, I'm going to do that then. Thank you. Oh, I'm getting all right. So you can see my slides, all right?
No, I just went into mine and I clicked multiple participants can share. So try it again.
Okay, how's that?
Yeah, that works.
Great, and I'll just make sure that they're active. Great, all right, thank you.
That's working.
So I'll stop sharing for now.
Yeah.
There we go.
Good morning.
Hello.
I'm Marie-Christine, Leslie's co-conspirator.
Yes, nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you.
Let's see, are we getting more people in? Yeah.
No, it's just that.
Hmm. So it looks like we have all of the panelists here. So what I figure we'll do is I'll introduce the panel. I'll introduce each of you individually before each of your papers, and then you'll deliver your papers and we'll save all the questions until the end. We'll wait to officially get started here in a second. All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the first panel of the morning. This is Ethics of Reading. So welcome everybody. I'm Drew Shannon and I'll be moderating the panel. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and introduce each individual speaker or sets of speakers as they deliver their papers, and we will have time at the end for questions. So if you want to start dropping questions in the chat along the way, Kai Hinson, our chat moderator, we'll keep track of those and we'll hit all of those once everything is finished. And at the end too, you probably all know the protocol by now, but there is a raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen. You can always use that to get my attention if you want to speak, and you can also just wave as long as you have your cameras on. But we will go ahead and start. And our first presenters are Lesley Higgins and Marie-Christine Leps. And Lesley Higgins is a professor of English at York University. She specializes in late Victorian and modernist studies. The author of The Cult of Ugliness, Aesthetic and Gender Politics. She has also edited 3 volumes of Gerard Manley Hopkins's prose. Research interests include world literature, feminist studies of modernism, textual studies, and poetry. With her is Marie-Christine Leps, an associate professor of English at York University, who is the founding coordinator of the Graduate Diploma in World Literature. Author of Apprehending the Criminal, The Production of Deviance, she specializes in literary and cultural history, world literature, and discourse analysis. Her current project focuses on fictions of friendship. In autumn 2022, Higgins and Leps will publish heterotopic world fiction, Thinking Beyond Biopolitics with Woolf, Foucault, and Ondaatje. And their paper is called Jeu d'Esprit, or Ethical Experiment, The Lessons of Flush. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Everyone can see the slides? We're great. Thank you. I will be presenting. I have that pleasure, and Marie-Christine will be answering the questions. Woolf's parodic biography of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's dog mounts a complex double argument, an argument against normalizing reading practices and for an ethics of reading generated instead shared responsibility for gender, racial, and class conflicts. Michel Foucault's concept of the experience book provides the grounds for our transgredient analysis. Against powerful truth regimes, Woolf and Foucault offer experience books, fictions that do more than demonstrate facts or establish historical truths. They engage the writer and reader in dialogical processes of becoming other. An experience book, Foucault insists, quote, is neither true nor false. An experience is always a fiction. It's something one fabricates oneself that doesn't exist before and will exist afterward. By entering into, quote, a difficult relationship with truth that in some degree destroys it, such fictions can function as agents of change. They constitute heterotopic spacetimes that, like a mirror, displace the reader into this other space in which the reader is not, yet is. The reader sees itself not to confirm an identity, but, in Woolf's words, to insubstantize all identification, to multiply, refract, and differentiate. To produce such fictions, the female artist must begin by gagging the voice of patriarchy. In Professions for Women, Woolf explains, the reader must destroy, quote, an immensely charming phantom, the angel in the house who stands between me and my paper. At last, I killed her. She died hard. Her fictitious nature was of great assistance to her. It is far harder to kill a phantom than a reality. Correspondingly, Foucault insists that intellectuals must distance themselves from a position of universality and work instead in localized struggles, in a new, quote, connection between theory and practice. An experience book, he states, unlike a truth book or a demonstration book, has the function, quote, of wrenching the subject from itself, of seeing to it that the subject is no longer itself, or that it is brought to its annihilation or its dissolution. This is a project of desubjectivization. Woolf concurs, avant Allègre, quote, great writers often require us to make heroic efforts in order to read them rightly. They bend us and break us. Reading such texts, quote, produces at first a queer feeling that the solid ground has been twitched from under us, and there we hang, asking questions in midair. We have gained a sense of astonishing freedom. Experience books move the reader from passive consumer of stable historical truths obtained from a fixed perspective to active, mobile co-producer of contingent knowledge. Quote, to adventure into that wilderness, Woolf warns, is an ordeal, an upsetting experience which plies the reader with questions, harries him with doubts, alternately delights and vexes him with pleasures and pains. Such texts block the reader's view of the past, exude doubt, cause exile from every assurance. This endearing coming-of-age story of a naive and affectionate Cocker Spaniel, a best-selling book of the Month Club selection, is not only a satirical indictment of intersecting discourses of gender, class, race, and empire, and the subject positions they delimit, but also a lesson in the limits of liberation tactics. Quoting from authorities, including poems, letters, and Thomas Beame's The Rookeries of London, this improbable tale asks the reader to see from two different positions, the unknowing, accepting, enthralled, and the knowing, discerning, resistant. Woolf's point of entry is to intervene in the circulation of Barrett Browning's legend in order to critique its discursive conditions of emergence. The romance of Sleeping Beauty, rescued by the dashing prince of poetry and swept away to a palace, was being revived again in Rudolph Bézier's The Barretts of Wimpole Street, which was a theatrical success de scandale that Woolf saw on the 6th of October, 1930. And this is a still from the production that she saw. Her response was twofold. In an essay on Aurora Leigh, she states, quote, nobody reads her, nobody discusses her, nobody troubles to put her in her place. In short, the only place in the mansion of literature that is assigned her is downstairs in the servants' quarters. More dramatically, Woolf displaces the poet's legend by creating a new one, all about her willing lapdog. By focusing on the pet, Woolf's satire provides the reader with a different way of experiencing the surround of archival facts to calculate the costs of love, love for women, dogs, and fathers, for romance, home and empire. Three main tactics are used, we are arguing: satire, correlation, and displacement. Satire initiates a complicitous relation between reader and writer, displacing both from recognized truths. Correlation critically assembles facts to generate new knowledge. Displacement transposes common truths onto geopolitical struggles, thereby foregrounding the epistemological and ethical imperatives of shared responsibilities. Tactic 1, satire. Flush stages what Barrett knows, that white middle-class women, and female poets in particular, enjoy the same standing as lapdogs. In a letter to Robert Browning, she stresses, "I am your Flush and he is mine." Woolf dramatizes the correlation rather than quote the passage. Flush is the physical, emotional, and social double of his mistress. Both share wide mouths, deep brown eyes, and heavy curls, quote, broken asunder, yet made in the same mold, each perhaps completed what was dormant in the other. Their complementarity fulfills Victorian understandings of womanhood. Imprisoned in the so-called bedroom school with Barrett as teacher, the male dog learns, quote, to resign, to control, to suppress. That is, to be meek, docile, dutiful, happy to lay quietly and lovingly at his mistress's feet, while the infant Elizabeth lays on the sofa, obeys her father's wishes, and writes. The lapdog of patriarchal relations of force. Flush is chained when walked. She, quote, could not go out. She was chained to the sofa. Love weakens both. Anthropomorphizing the dog allows the text to flush commonplace truths supporting great men and subjugating women down the satirical drain, desiccating romance. For all who adore the Barrett Browning legend, Woolf's tale is a warning. Flush's mind, imagined as that of an upper-class gentleman, serves as prism for the commonplace truths that exercise power through a series of essentialist assumptions. The dog's biographer uses earnest, and hence farcical, tales of etymology, conquest, and breeding to gush over his subject's eminence. Canine determination of pedigree, established by the Spaniel Club, is judged superior to that of the Herald's College by the narrator, who grudgingly admits, however, quote, that the latter at least makes some attempt to preserve the purity of the human family. The correlation defamiliarizes the deadly desideratum of racialized purity, as extends from Barrett Browning's day to Woolf's, from eugenics to Nazis, and to the present. Animal husbandry, both business and source of pleasure, is thus positioned as yet another story of conquest and legitimation, articulated to race and gender, trophy pets, trophy wives, and trophy daughters. The biographer's assurance is continually satirized from the first words that state, a la Austen, it is universally admitted that. Reveling in the wealth of information on canine heritage, the narrator laments the absence of same for servants. The reader, however, is made to notice what does not count. Always present, servants remain imperceptible, their material conditions unnoticed. Even the biographer's extended endnote on the faithful servant Lily Wilson and, quote, the great army of her kind, the inscrutable, the all but silent, the all but invisible servant maids of history, can only dwell parenthetically, quote, for a second on the extreme precariousness of a servant's life. Thus, the text demonstrates how ignorance is produced as vehicle of power relations, thereby duplicating the effects of the Browning legend. Correlating gender and class multiplies and compounds the impact of systematically generated ignorance. Tactic 2, correlation. Spatial correlations highlight class divisions in racialized terms. The narrator reveals that, quote, not a stone's throw from Wimpole Street, behind Miss Barrett's bedroom, for instance, is St. Giles, quote, one of the worst slums in London. Quoting the Rookeries of London, which describes St. Giles, quote, as a penal settlement, a pauper metropolis in itself, The narrator then moves on to Whitechapel, the East End slum where, quote, poverty and vice and misery had bred and seethed and propagated their kind for centuries without interference. The narrator recycles themes to create Flush's understanding of Whitechapel when held for ransom. He sees, quote, hordes of half-naked men and women, these horrible monsters. Some were ragged, others were flaring with paint and feathers, squatted on the floor. The demons pawed and clawed. Even more unsettling for Flush is the sight of, quote, the dogs of the highest breeding. Chained dogs, footmen's dogs like himself, behaving like their subhuman captors. Quote, they tore and worried a festering bone that they had got between them. Flush and his biographer are disturbed by the lack of essential differentiation. Breeding, high or low, should always tell, regardless of material circumstances. Such correlations, however, highlight the functions of using racialized discourse to apprehend the working classes, to serve as alibi for ruthless exploitation, and conceal how Wimpole Street rests comfortably on Whitechapel misery. Discourses of race, class, and gender are forcibly correlated in the physical and dramatic center of the biography. When Flush is dog-napped, power relations are exposed and reversed, and both the dog and his mistress are transformed. The balance of power is suddenly destabilized. To her astonishment, the men surrounding Barrett choose to fight, quote, in the interest of their class by refusing to negotiate with the thieves. Up until the June 1845 Bill for the Further Prevention of the Offense of Dog Stealing, ransoming dogs was a booming business rather than a crime. One could be sentenced to 7 years transportation for stealing a dog's collar, it was noted during parliamentary debate, but one could steal a dog with impunity. The recalcitrance to recognize dogs as property stemmed from their association with feminine emotional attachment rather than utility. Legislation was enacted only after Parliament received a petition and a report from the Select Committee on Dog Stealing. When Flush is stolen in 1846, Barrett's father and brothers, and even her then secret fiancé, all reject the ransom demand. Paying it, Robert Browning argues, would be, quote, a lamentable weakness, positioning anyone who did so on the side, quote, of the execrable policy of the world's husbands, fathers, brothers, and domineers in general. Left without allies, Barrett conscripts her terrified maid and goes to Whitechapel. From her carriage window, she sees what she has been trained to ignore, a mysterious world, quote, where women lived like herself while she lay on her sofa, reading, writing. They lived thus. They were to inspire the most vivid passages in Aurora Leigh. Woolf's text refuses to sentimentalize the scene of recognition. Elizabeth forces her horrified maid into submission. She never leaves her carriage. She hurries back home to her privilege and still must demand her brother's help to get Flush back. Yet, the text also insists that, quote, Miss Barrett was not to be intimidated. Rejecting the role assigned to her, she will not submit to the will and reasoning of the men who love her, even at the risk of losing her beloved good opinion. Both poet and servant know that Flush's value is not to be monetized, not to be circumscribed in terms of class or gender. They know the bonds of love and duty that tie them to this living creature and will not let men fight proxy class wars over its body. Tactic 3, displacement. Structured as a series of spatial displacements, the novel tells a tale of progressive enlightenment, from the innocent minority of puppydom at 3 Mile Cross to adolescent pretensions of racial superiority on Wimpole Street, forcefully destroyed by Whitechapel, to majority, with freedom, democracy, happiness, and world citizenship in Florence. Each stage in that Bildungsroman is marked by a concomitant detachment from previous identities. In Italy, where the Spaniel Club does not reign, Flush softens towards mongrels. Quote, he was the friend of all the world now. All dogs were his brothers. The final aha moment comes when Flush loses all marks of pedigree when shaved by Browning to relieve him from the torment of fleas, a suffering correlated, quote, to Savonarola's martyrdom here in Florence. At first feeling emasculated, diminished, ashamed, Flush then reconsiders, quote, what am I now? He was nobody. Certainly he was no longer a Cocker Spaniel. But he soon realizes that to be nothing, that is not, after all, the most satisfactory state in the world. Reading this triumphant Enlightenment life story in all its sweetness and formidable prose no doubt accounts for the novel's success, a bestseller in both the UK and the US. Barrett Browning is equally transformed, quote, for fear was unknown in Florence. There were no dog stealers here, and, she may have sighed, there were no fathers. But soon enough, Barrett Browning can be seen staring into nothingness, as she did in London, but now also subjugating herself to, quote, evil-smelling, seedy-looking men and their seances. Flush outlines the limits of liberation narratives by making the dog the philosopher and the poet the victim of hoaxes in a city they both misread as the land of milk and honey. Thus, only the reader learns to know differently. Because the dog and its biographer cannot or will not read Barrett Browning's work, like those who love the brilliant, the doomed, the adored poet, but ignore her poetry, they overlook her engagement in world political struggles. They cannot know that Casaguidi Windows, after embracing populism, laments the return of marching troops. They cannot know about her anti-slavery work and A Curse for the Nation, nor her poems before Congress. Having demonstrated that the legendary only makes sense within relations of domination and subjugation, Woolf's satire asks the reader to refocus on material struggles, to reconsider Il Duce's Italy, to refuse quiescence. Her writing, quote, takes us and reads us, flouts our preconceptions, questions principles which we had got into the habit of taking for granted, and in fact splits into two parts as we read, making us, even as we enjoy, yield our ground or stick to our guns. In short, Flush teaches us a new ethics of reading. Thank you very much.
Okay, and will Marie-Christine be talking in the Q&A afterwards, Lesley? Yes?
Yes,
Okay,
yes, thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on to Luca Pinelli. Luca studied at the University of Oxford and the University of Bologna and is currently a second-year PhD student in transcultural studies in the humanities at the University of Bergamo, Italy, in conjunction with the Université Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris. His research project investigates the intersections between the two mothers of second-wave feminism, Virginia Woolf and Simone de Beauvoir. His research interests include Oscar Wilde and the fin de siècle, English modernism, European feminisms, queer theory, phenomenology, and radical writing. And his paper is entitled Towards an Ethics of Sexual Textual Ambiguity, Virginia Woolf, Simone de Beauvoir, and the Ethics of Reading. So, Luca.
Hi, thank you, Drew, for the introduction. Can you all see my presentation? Yes, okay, perfect,
Yes.
Thank you. Let me see if I can start the slideshow. Yeah, okay. So in the final version of How Should One Read the Book, published in the Second Common Reader in 1932, Virginia Woolf famously wrote that independence of thought is the most important quality that a reader can possess. While in society it may be important to be bound by laws and conventions, in the act of reading we have none, and we should never respect the authority of other people, however heavily furred and gowned they may be. If we could banish all such preconceptions when we read, Woolf goes on to argue, that would be an admirable beginning. Her advice is then framed in the following terms, and this is the third quote on my slide. Do not dictate to your author, try to become him. be his fellow worker and accomplice. If you hang back and reserve and criticize at first, you are preventing yourself from getting the fullest possible value from what you read. But if you open your mind as widely as possible, then signs and hints of almost imperceptible fineness from the twist and turn of the first sentences will bring you into the presence of a human being unlike any other. Nearly 30 years later, in 1964, Simone de Beauvoir gave a lecture on the role of literature. Her talk, published a year later, is premised on the idea that literature is, and I quote Beauvoir, if it is authentic, a means of overcoming separation by affirming it. As Beauvoir goes on to argue, and I quote again, literature only begins at the moment when I hear a singular voice. In fact, we attach much more importance to language than we sometimes say. There is no literature if there is not a voice, that is to say, language that bears the mark of someone. It takes a style, a tone, a technique, an art, an invention. It can be something quite different depending on the writer. The author must impose their presence on me, and when they impose on me their presence, at the same time, they impose their world on me. End of quote. In both accounts of the reading process, the author seems to be a spectral presence in the text, with the letter bearing some distinguishing marks of its producer. The reader's task, in Woolf and Beauvoir's view, is to immerse themselves in the language of a text, to become the author, to enter their singular world through that language. In particular, in the first part of the process, Woolf suggests suspending judgment on what is being read in order to let oneself be absorbed in the narrative without necessarily producing an argument about it. Beauvoir's insistence on the notion of voice equally draws attention to how perceptive readers have to be in order to approach another person's world as represented and mediated by a text. In both accounts, the first task of a reader is to let the text resonate with them so they can create a communication channel with a different world. In her second philosophical essay, The Ethics of Ambiguity, published in 1947, Beauvoir highlights the tragic ambiguity of the human condition, and I quote Beauvoir, "The subject is still a part of this world of which he is a consciousness. He asserts himself as a pure internality against which no external power can take hold, and he also experiences himself as a thing crushed by the dark weight of other things. This privilege which he alone possesses of being a sovereign and unique subject amidst a universe of objects is what he shares with all his fellow men. In turn, an object for others, he is nothing more than an individual in the collectivity on which he depends." End of quote. The human condition is profoundly ambiguous, Beauvoir argues, because human subjects are torn between the position of sovereign subject operating as a consciousness in the world and that of object of other people's actions. Faced with this position or situation, as Beauvoir calls it, the human subject is meant to overcome it by pursuing ends that construct a future that is different from the past and the present. This drive to renew existence, to construct a different situation, is termed transcendence. Its opposite is immanence, the state of perpetuation of the given in Beauvoir's terminology. I would argue that if we adapt Beauvoir's dichotomy to the act of reading, immersing ourselves in the text as we read is what we could call textual immanence, whereas transcendence would imply bringing something more to the text so that it speaks to our times and all needs. If it is important that women think back through their mothers, as Woolf argues in A Room One's Own, I think it's necessary for us all, regardless of our sex or gender, to think back through our mothers of thought, to use an expression used by some feminists in the 1970s. In this context, my paper intends to be a tribute to Toria Moy because she has paved the way for my research by functioning as a watershed in the reception of Woolf and in that of Beauvoir. In Sexual Textual Politics, published in 1985, Moy famously tried to restore the feminist quality of Woolf's work by highlighting how misunderstood she was, even among feminist critics. In the second half of Sexual Textual Politics, she opened her section on French feminism by focusing on Beauvoir's Marxist feminism, and remarked how this model was mostly taken over by Lacanian psychoanalysis and what would be naturalized as French feminism in the following years. That is the Holy Trinity of Sexou, Irigaray, and Kristeva. And I've included a reference to a wonderful paper by Christine Delphi, who's a French materialist feminist at the time, which explores this relationship between Anglo-American criticism and French feminism. Almost a decade later, Moy published one of the landmark texts on Beauvoir, Simone de Beauvoir, the Making of an Intellectual Woman in 1994, which was incidentally republished in a second revised edition in 2008, as previously unpublished material came to light. The first half of the title of my paper is clearly an echo of Moy's 1985 text, Sexual Textual Politics. This is because I would like to open Beauvoir's notion of existential ambiguity to the interplay between sex and text in a way that should resonate with anyone who's familiar with Moy's work. The Norwegian critic stressed the importance of the textual strategies implemented by women in their works, so that Woolf's theory of androgyny, for instance, should not be interpreted, Parcher, Showalter, and other scholars, as a flight from femininity. Instead, Moy convincingly shows how it is necessary to work on, and I quote her, a feminist criticism that would do both justice and homage to its great mother and sister without rejecting her as an insufficiently feminist or praising her on grounds that seem to exclude her fiction. End of quote. In her view, these were the two main problems in the reception of Woolf at the time. So she was either discounted because she was not feminist enough, or she was praised, but just for the essays, not for the novels and short fiction. In Beauvoirian terms, the ambiguity of Woolf's theorization in her essays, especially in her Room 1 zone, was only treated at the time in its transcendence. That is to say, many feminist critics were looking for a mother of thought who could point them in the right direction, and they were hoping to find this direction in Woolf. This also happened, for instance, in Italy, as Elisa Bolchi's wonderful work on the Italian reception of Woolf shows. In her latest article published in The Italianist, Bolchi points to the history of a Milanese feminist collective who, based on Italian feminist philosopher Luisa Muraro's work, started looking for a potential feminine and feminist genealogy by looking at fiction written by women in the preceding decades. The act of reading in that group was, as Bolchi emphasizes, a political one, and therefore the group used literary texts to stimulate personal and political observations that could orient the political praxis towards more theory-inflected articulations, end of quote. While the group insisted on the void and the silence into which women living under patriarchal ideology were relegated, and in line with Irigaray's thought, they were hoping to explore that subaltern position rather than filling the void, they found in Woolf a woman writer who attempted to do precisely what they felt was not really necessary, at least for them, that is, filling the void. The result was that these feminists were drawn to Gertrude Stein rather than Woolf, because as Bolchi explains, and I quote, although they found Woolf's metaphor of the room useful, they also found that Woolf conceptualized the desire to fill the void with a literary language that was still observant of male symbolic order. End of quote. This reading with a purpose, however useful from a political and even personal point of view, seems to be at odds with the ethics of reading as elaborated by Woolf, Beauvoir, and Moy. What goes over the reader's head in cases like this is precisely the sexual textual ambiguity of Woolf's fiction or essays. By reducing ambiguity to a set of arguments or to linear narratives, these readers cannot appreciate Woolf's sometimes oblique critique of patriarchal ideology because they were looking for a style that was more in line with Irigaray's notion of écriture féminine. A recent article by Valérie Favre, A Room 1 Zone's Resistance to Feminist Interpretations and Feminism, published in 2020, not only summarizes the debates on the kind of feminism proposed by Woolf, often understood according to the essentialism versus constructivism binary, but also proposes a convincing reading of the text. As Favre encapsulates it, and I quote, Woolf develops a textual strategy which both resists feminist direction and precludes any definitive any definitive feminist interpretations or appropriations of the essay, but she also openly, if partly ironically, disavows feminism and sketches out an elusive feminism of her own, end of quote. As the room clearly shows an allegiance, somewhat paradoxically, to both of the main strands of feminist theory, that is essentialism and constructivism, any criticism of this text should acknowledge this openly without necessarily suggesting that one or the other theory is preferred by Woolf or her narrative personae. Reading ethically means accounting for the sexual textual ambiguity of a work like A Room without necessarily instrumentalizing it for practical ends. If we're only interested in finding in a text something specific and practical, we cannot suspend judgment and let ourselves be carried away by the narrative. Like the Milanese and the Anglo-American feminists of the 1970s, we might be tempted to find a direction in the text, which nevertheless always eludes us, at least in the case of Woolf. In How Should One Read a Book, and again, I'm referring to the final version as published in the second Common Reader series, Woolf is far from giving, sorry, that was a bit of a spoiler there. Woolf is far from giving actual advice to her readers, despite her wonderful formulations about becoming the author and suspending judgment. Woolf pursues a line of thought that is far from linear. If I were to represent her argument in this final version of the essay, the line would probably zigzag through the text without ever reaching much of a conclusion. Woolf, or the narrator, says that in the first part of the reading process, we should suspend our judgment and immerse ourselves in the flux of fleeting impressions that are part of the narrative. Then she suggests that reading is a bit like writing, so we should try and write something ourselves. In order to do so, we should turn to the classics, like Defoe, Jane Austen, or Thomas Hardy. And yet, no, we should never discount other books because they're not art, whatever that means. And so the narrator goes on to point to all sorts of questions that literary theory has not quite answered yet, like how far, and I'm quoting Woolf, how far is a book influenced by its writer's life? Or how far shall we resist or give way to the sympathies and antipathies that the man himself rouses in us? When we're almost ready to write, we should turn to poetry instead, possibly comparing different poems and poets. And yet this word compare, how difficult a task it conceals in its recesses. So Woolf goes on to argue that a second part of the reading process is necessary, and I quote Woolf again, we must pass judgment upon these multitudinous impressions. We must make of these fleeting shapes one that is hard and lasting. End of quote. The second part, however, is much more of a challenge than the first one, and I quote Woolf again, to continue reading without the book before you, to have read widely enough and with enough understanding to make such comparisons alive and illuminating, that is difficult. It is still more difficult to press further and to say, not only is the book of this sort, but it is of this value, here it fails, here it succeeds, this is bad, that is good. To carry out this part of a reader's duty needs such imagination, insight, and learning that it is hard to conceive any one mind sufficiently endowed. Impossible for the most self-confident to find more than the seeds of such powers in himself. End of quote. Would it be easier to leave this task to the gowned critic she initially asked us to ignore then? Perhaps it would be easier, but we should not abandon our quest as readers, because reading passionately is an unparalleled virtue. Not even St. Peter at the gate of paradise will be able to promise anything better than that. This not quite so concise and yet non-exhaustive summary of her arguments already shows that zigzagging movement of her voice in the text. If we immerse ourselves in its textual immanence, if we become Woolf as she interrogates herself on how to read a book, we are disarmed and helpless and possibly amused by her tone and sagacity. If we bring to the text some of the literary theory the rest of humanity has been coming up with, we are transcending what the essay is saying in order to let it answer different questions in different ways. What remains important, as Beauvoir emphasizes in the Ethics of Ambiguity, is acknowledging that even, and I quote, the most optimistic ethics have all begun by emphasizing the element of failure involved in the condition of man. Without failure, no ethics. Well, our task as readers is to activate the ambiguity of the text without slipping into the extremes of textual immanence or textual transcendence. It is fundamental to remember that it takes time to do so. And during our attempts at grappling with the textuality that sometimes evades us, we should always be alert to textual practices we are privileging and why. Without this self-criticism, without time, without constant questioning of our methods and our aims, there is no ethical reading. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Luca. All right, so we will now move on to our final speaker, who is Marie Allègre, and she is a fourth-year PhD candidate and French tutor at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Her doctoral thesis explores the psychoanalytic, especially Lacanian and post-Lacanian receptions of Virginia Woolf produced in the English and French traditions between the late 1980s and the early 2020s. She is on the organizing committee of the Graduate Center for Europe at her home institution and part of the French Feminist Research Network. Please pronounce that for me, Marie. I'll get it wrong.
It's called Les Jaseuses.
Les Ages. Okay,
Yeah.
I would have been close. So thank you, Marie. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Drew. Can you all see my screen all right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. So thank you very much, Drew, for the introduction and to obviously all of the organizers for this conference. It's really, it's a genuine pleasure. So my paper today, yeah, by the way, I put a link to the paper in the chat if you want to follow along on the Google document. So my paper today is entitled Working with Virginia Woolf's Ethics, Reparative Psychoanalytic Literary Criticism. So from the complexification of relations between fact and fiction through Orlando's queered androgyny to her staging of ambivalence and her stylistic uses of tensions, Woolf's crossed womanship bears witness to what we can call, if it works, there we go, to what we can call the irreducible heterogeneity of lived experience and embodiment. And I'm happy to obviously unpack everything I've just mentioned in the Q&A. And it is precisely in this accommodation of manifoldedness and contradiction, this aesthetic resistance to elucidation, that I locate Woolf's ethics. This means that here, I take ethics to mean being attuned to complexity and to the individual and collective responsibility that this makes room for and requires. In turn, I would define an ethics of reading and interpreting Woolf as relying on a similar refusal of univocity, a preservation of the multifarious and sometimes contradictory paths she sends us on, perhaps also as an awareness of her theoretical investments of her reading. So psychoanalysis has been interested in Woolf's treatment of, I quote from Woolf, that queer conglomeration of incongruous things, the modern mind, from about the 1930s. From the 1970s onwards, Woolf's critics and the feminist scholars amongst them, notably, reinvested various psychoanalytic frameworks such as Freud's object relation theory and from the 1980s Lacanian and post-Lacanian interpretation. And it is the latter set of intersection that my thesis investigates. To what extent have Woolf's Lacanian and post-Lacanian receptions been hospitable to her propositions? So referring to paradigmatic examples, this paper argues that more often than not, Woolf's binary or non-dualistic ethics have either been obfuscated or commodified by Oedipal perspectives. And in turn, what does an ethical conversation between Woolf's work and psychoanalysis look like? Drawing on metacritical approaches, my thesis makes the case for reparative reading, one that starts from and addresses, also incorporates what Oedipal theory has participated in othering. In 1971, psychoanalyst Andre Green argues that the only unconscious material to which the psychoanalytic critic can have access to and tap is their own. The interpretation of the text, therefore, becomes, I quote, the interpretation that the critic must give himself of the effect of the text on his own unconscious, end quote. And Green recommends that this subjective epistemology, as he calls it, quote, this exercise in self-analysis be preceded by an analysis performed by another, or if one prefers, by an analysis of the other, end quote. My thesis proposition continues Green's, but with the difference that I understand this analysis of the other to refer specifically to the psychoanalytic discourse on Woolf itself. And this is all the more relevant since, as Green insists, the psychoanalytic critic, just like all critics obviously, comes to the text with all the theoretical knowledge he is steeped in. More recently, Rita Felsky states that, I quote, scholars identify like mad. They are no less invested than others in the works they respond to. Indeed, they're often more invested, even if the reasons for their investments and the idioms in which they express them differ from the non-academic reader, as it were. Self-described text worker and French critic Émilie Noteris recently reinvested Cedric's notion of reparative reading with reference to the ancestral Japanese art of kintsugi. So the idea is like when mending a broken plate or cup, one does not glue pieces back together trying to hide the cracks, but one magnifies the reparation with gold leaves. And the result of such process is an object that both reflects the wreckage and creates something new from it. In turn, I take reparative criticism to refer to a process that highlights the restrictive matrix at the heart of Oedipal interpretations, and that puts them in conversation with non-binary epistemologies to include what they have served to obscure, but without denying the history of this foreclosure. So what I have endeavored to do within the scope of my thesis, in Derrida's words, is to begin with the other, starting from what his system tried to exclude. So Oedipal and especially Lacanian and post-Lacanian readings of Woolf tend to refer to interactions with, amongst other things, the non-human in strictly anthropocentric and binary gendered terms. And this has a twofold consequence. First, literary Lacanianism renders binary what in Woolf is more of a dialectics persistently exceeded in the matter of what Merleau-Ponty has called a hyperdialectic. I quote, a dialectic without synthesis, which is not a sign of futility, but of a good dialectic. And the corollary to this reduction is that the phenomenological, non-anthropocentric insights of Woolf's texts are at best unrecorded and at worst simplified and pathologized. French psychoanalyst and modernist scholar Josiane Paco-Huguet reads To the Lighthouse, in her own words, I quote, as a jarring review, harboring a semiotic code and deciphered truth of buried affects at its core. And these she approaches with a structural framework based on an aesthetic of lack. I quote, Lacan's novelty with respect to traditional philosophical discourse is that it defines object relations in terms of lack. And this is Paco-Huguet's quote. As a result, Mrs. Ramsay's moment of being, watching the lighthouse at night, reads, Paco-Huguet writes, as I quote, a point of contact with the real, which abolishes the distinction between subject and object. And indeed, the ambivalent scene does seem to lend itself to such a reading. So what we have, among other things, is the last stroke of the lighthouse feeling like, quote, her own eyes meeting her own eyes. And then she has a sense of becoming one with the lighthouse as with a lover. Then we've got the ominous notion of being, quote, at the beck and call of the light, the polysemy of the stroke as well, which is both a caress and a blow. And obviously the close to orgasmic end of the passage. I quote, the ecstasy burst in her eyes and waves of pure delight raced over the floor of her mind. And she felt, it is enough, it is enough. So all of that would tend to be coherent with Paco-Huguet's idea of a dangerous excess of enjoyment. And what this is, in Paco-Huguet's perspective, is an attempt to return to the unmourned for mother. I quote, the gaze is turned inwards towards a vanishing point, the spot of time often related to a maternal object endowed with too much enjoyment and gone too soon, which was obviously Woolf's case. And we can talk about that last bit in the Q&A if people are interested in that. In other words, the subject becomes one with the object in the attempt to join the mother in non-being. And this is also, by the way, how Pacoguet describes Mrs. Ramsay's quote unquote feminine mode of enjoyment of the sonnet later on in the novel. I quote, "She tastes the sounds and the color of object words among which her body forgets its own existence until it becomes the thing itself." So Mrs. Ramsay's ecstatic contemplations have become a hypnotic flirt with psychic death, something which is emphasized by evoking Rhoda from The Waves, about whom Pacoguet writes. She was never ushered into the dialectics of lack and desire. So not only does this equate any experience in uncharted territory with psychic regression and solipsism, but the association of Mrs. Ramsay with Rhoda also smoothes out distinctions between the two stories and characters. Mrs. Ramsay does not dissolve in melancholy, I think. If anything, hers are moments of complex, ambivalent emotion and pleasure, which Oedipal structures rather simplify. And as a counter example, we can think about Elsa Hochberg's reading of that passage of To the Lighthouse yesterday. What matters in the example I just gave is more the application of the Lacanian structure than Woolf's craft and readers' experiences. And this is obvious in the fact that Pacoguet often uses the phrase, this structure, this Lacanian structure is enacted in. And within this well-oiled psychoanalytic mechanism, there does not seem to be a non-binary, non-dualistic alternative to either the symbolic or an engulfing real. And this is rather similar to Patrick McGee's reading of The Waves as a novel that, I quote, destroys the separation between subject and object. And McGee also misses the life affirmative aspects of Woolf's images and novel in all their uncannyness and ambivalence, because he reads Woolf's, quote, fin in the waste of waters as, I quote, cadaverized, reduced to a dead shell of meaning. On the contrary, I think that it is this form of Lacanianism that reduces Woolf's explorations to conceptual skeletons. As Woolf has it herself, I quote, "When philosophy is not consumed in a novel, when we can underline this phrase with a pencil and cut out that exhortation with a pair of scissors and paste it into a whole system, it is safe to say that there is something wrong with the philosophy, or with the novel, or with both." As phenomenological accounts of Woolf highlights, her work, I think, does not destroy the boundaries between subject and object, throwing characters and readers alike into psychic chaos. Rather, her texts seem to imply that a neat binary division between subject and object is nothing but a dangerous, although reassuring, fantasy. So we could say that her novels give us Woolf's personal version of quantum ontology, so based on the existence of phenomena rather than of independently existing things. If Anne Benfield's celebrated but rather dualist reading of Woolf does not really go beyond binary frameworks, she does make the following key point. I quote, "Woolf's characteristic conception of death is the separation of subject and object. Death is one name for their independence." End of quote. So when life is recorded from the perspective of a flower bed in Kew Gardens, or when a voice describes the Ramsays' empty house and time passes, even though no one is there to look or listen, I don't think that Woolf is anticipating the Lacanian real. Rather, her use of anthropomorphism in her description of the non-human is precisely what goes against anthropocentric ontology. By placing subjectivity in the non-human, Woolf gives it back its agency, therefore making room for the unobserved, so what Anne Benfield has called unoccupied perspectives. And this is, I think, Woolf's radical means to represent the world not as governed by binary principles, but as what new materialisms speak of as entangled phenomena. In a recent edited collection of psychoanalytic responses to new materialisms, Catherine Van Wert reads, I quote, "Virginia Woolf avec Lacan contra Deleuze." And she argues that Deleuzian and new materialist emphases on multiplicity and becoming act like, quote, a totalizing force that cancels subjective destitution in a false promise of plenitude. In other words, new materialist perspectives negate the split at the heart of human subjectivity, the one enacted by language, so symbolic castration. However, new materialist and non-binary readings of Woolf do not posit, quote, a desire that lacks nothing. Rather, the aim is to conceptualize an outside of the binary, lack-based set of alternatives opposing subjective dissolution to castration. So what Woolf describes, in other words, only escapes the symbolic if the symbolic in question is a binary one. So, and this will be my concluding sentences, turning symptomatic reading against a certain form of Lacanianism, my thesis aims at giving a more generative account of Woolf's works. So not one which would be the only viable one, but one which is nevertheless present. And this necessary if one is to be able, as Rita Felsky puts it, quote, to teach students ways of analyzing texts that open up new experiences of these texts. Or again, as Woolf writes, quote, to find that state of mind in which it seems possible to us to write the book, not to read it. In June 1940, Woolf dreams of inventing, I quote, a new critical method, something swifter and lighter and more colloquial and yet intense, more to the point and less composed, more fluid and following the flight, end quote. And I believe it is possible, as Woolf writes, to keep, quote, the flight of the mind, yet be exact, to create hospitable critical spaces that would no longer be described as a denial of symbolic castration. Thank you very much to everyone for your time.
Thank you, Marie, and Luca and Lesley for those terrific papers. We can go about this a couple of ways. I think I don't know if there are questions in the chat, or we can just begin by opening up to questions. People can raise their hands, jump in, however you would like to proceed. Do we have questions? Maggie.
Sorry. Absolutely fabulous papers. Really moved by them, actually. I just want to try and tie together Luca's and Marie's, possibly, in that reading my collection of Italian feminist thought, which I can't remember when I bought it, it may have been 1975 even. One of the key ethical concepts in it is this notion of pairs of women acting as mothers to other women, as mentors, as supporters. Importantly, not your mother, but doing that. And the Milanese bookshop, as it was known, promulgated this idea. And it does seem to tie in with Marie's theory, ideas of post-Lacanianism, because one key post-Lacanian thinker is Broca Ettinger, whose theory of the matrixial gaze I've always found very compelling. And I wondered if you might like to say how that fits in with your ideas.
Yes, thanks, Maggie, for that. Actually, I read one of your articles about Broca Ettinger, and I really liked it. And I started to read one of her books, and then I thought, oh God, I'll have to go back to chapter writing. So I haven't actually used it in my thesis, but it was definitely one of my biggest regrets, because one of the kind of the limits of my work is that I kind of open up psychoanalysis with non-binary epistemologies, but I would like to turn to, you know, current non-binary psychoanalytic theory in order to, like, you know, not just be like, just, you know, this is not working, to just use something. And I think that I kind of was surprised, and like I don't think that Ettinger has ever worked on Woolf, has she?
No, but she's got an exhibition currently, and this is rather interesting for me, in which Nicolas Bourriard has put on in Paris. I think it's in Paris, and they both agree that his theory of relational aesthetics seems to work with Broca, with Ettinger.
Yeah.
And I was just struck because I was so pleased to hear that reference to the Italian feminists that I had found so exciting in the 70s, to hear that again. And I thought that maybe it was a link between both of your work, which obviously it never occurred to me till I heard your papers today. But yeah, I find Griselda Pollock on Ettinger much easier to understand.
Yeah, because I read her preface to the book, and I was like, oh yeah, that's clear as day. Very helpful. Yes, I need to dive in a bit more. I need to go back to it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Other questions and comments? Yes, Gwen.
This is a question for Luca. Wonderful paper, and it's not directly related, but I'm just wondering, since I feel that you obviously work a lot with Woolf and Beauvoir, if you've been applying this in your further work to some of their novels or their fiction, and I'm just curious where you might see that playing out in their other work that's not not nonfiction or essayistic.
Thank you for that question, Gwen. Good to see you here online. We've been writing emails. Yeah, so, well, I have to say this is not really part of my thesis. So my thesis is going in a slightly different direction. So my idea for this paper was just to, pay homage to Tori Moy's work and think about the ethics of reading from Woolf to Beauvoir and back. And obviously that, as I tried to show, that applies especially to the essays, because, we generally have the idea that essays have to give us some kind of straightforward message that we can take home and then apply to our life or to other sorts of writing. But whenever you read an essay by Woolf, you'll find much more than that, and you probably don't find the nugget of pure truth that she refers to in the Room One Zone, and so that's where I got the idea for this paper. But my thesis does look at 3 novels by Woolf through mainly Beauvoir's philosophy. So I'm looking at Orlando, The Waves, and Between the Acts. And I have to say that the concept is slightly different. So there's no ethics in it. It's more about the body and intercorporeality. So I try to adapt some of the notions that we can borrow from phenomenology to the analysis of 3 of Woolf's novels. So yeah, it's kind of a different thing, but yeah, thank you for your question.
Thank you for your answer, and that's perfectly fair. I'd love to read that as well, but another time.
Let's see, Professor Higgins.
Thank you, Professor Shannon. Appreciate that. This is a great panel. Thank you so much. So thought-provoking. I'll be thinking about this the rest of the day, probably. And actually, the previous question, Gwen's question, actually, I think anticipated something that I had in mind that was also looped back around to Lesley and Marie Christine's attention to flush as satire, and so this distinction between essays and fiction, the reference to satire. This is a question for the whole panel. I'm kind of curious how distinctions between genre, sort of in general, factor into some of these theories of reading, right? If, for instance, each paper in some ways is deriving an ethics of reading from Woolf that we might bring methodologically to Woolf, how does that, especially given Woolf's own interest in genre, which she shows us in How Should One Read a Book, how does sort of moving among genre fit into your sort of ideas or reflections on ethics, right? Is it part of that? How does it play in, say, to ambiguity, or into that irreducible heterogeneity, or into some of these other concepts or distinctions? So I hope that makes sense, but I was just kind of curious how genre, maybe in general or specific genres, factor into this.
Marie-Christine, I see you unmuted. Go ahead.
Well, if I may, I think your question goes to the heart of the matter. And Lesley and I just completed a book where we argue that Woolf, Foucault, and Ondaatje are actually crafting a new genre, which is heterotopic world fiction. And that through this genre, they can launch a series of experiments and experiences for the reader, so that the chronotope that this genre produces is transhistorical and transnational, because all of them go back to, Herodotus and ancient Greeks and Gilgamesh, and they also project to this possible future, so that the genre is the thing. I think you're absolutely right. And by crafting a kind of subgenre of world literature, they are enabling a different experience, a heterotopic experience for the reader. Because the genre, heterotopic world fiction, is not just about space, but about heterotopic processes of knowing. I could go on, but there are other speakers who have been asked the same question.
Thank you for that. Very interesting. And I think, by the way, your book is in the promotional flyer that Amy has sent around. So
shipping in September.
Right. So just want to shout out.
How fresh is that? Thank you.
Hot off the press.
Well, and thank you for the plug. If I may add, as many people know, the excitement of being a promo code is unlike anything else in our academic lives. Could I just add, though, that Ben, your very good question also reminds us about one of the challenges of reading Woolf, and this is something that I would say is something that is entrenched in a lot of the Woolf scholarship prior to the 1980s, and that is, not only is she not allowed to have a sense of humor, but there is no understanding of, shall we say, the tactical use of irony and of satire. And that's one of the things we're most interested in our work. And I would have to say, I think the first critic I ever read who suggested that there was, we needed to think about satire in relation to Jacob's Room. Otherwise, it's just a sad book. I mean, at the end, holding up the shoes, why are we not in tears? Because I would suggest the novel wants us to be in tears, and at the same time going slap, slap. It's Alex Wordling in Virginia Woolf in the Real World who, suggests not to appreciate the irony in satire is to miss the point, which, and then I'll stop because other people want to contribute. For us, we're arguing that not to appreciate irony and satire and how tactically they are deployed by Woolf is to not understand not only the ethics of reading that she is always working out and trying to engage the reader in, but also to understand the profound politics of her work. And we've seen in these conferences and the wonderful volumes that come out of the conferences how these shifts in thinking about Woolf and working with Woolf have changed. And I would say, to your very good question, that irony and satire are really our way in. That's what these books give us, even when they seem to be the most sympathetic or the most tender or the saddest. Not to appreciate these other points of view that are flourishing is to miss the point.
Derek.
Thank you. Great panel. I'm tempted to ask all sorts of theoretical questions after the last two papers, which are very thought-provoking and lots of ideas coming from those. But actually what I would like to do is keep Lesley and Marie-Christine speaking for a little bit longer, if that's okay. Because yeah, I love this run through of the various strategies that Woolf uses in Flush, but I also loved your PowerPoint. And what it did for me is it really made clear and made me think a lot about how the illustrations become part of those strategies. And there was, so we've got the illustrations that Woolf included, but actually there was one illustration that you included that I hadn't seen before. And I wondered if you could put it up again so that we could have another look. It's the, I think if I followed it correctly, it's a portrait of Flush by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Is that right? I wondered if you could tell us something more about that and whether there are other portraits by Elizabeth Barrett Browning of Flush. Anything you can tell me about that would be, I'd be really interested to hear.
Okay, so you're asking me to turn things back on. So if you,
absolutely,
yes. If you'll just give me a second, I have the PowerPoint. Hang on, can I share my screen?
Yeah,
Drew, is that all right?
Yeah, you should be able to.
Okay, you notice all right, so everyone can see the slides. So let me just go through them quickly. Yes, this was something that we found, you know, the pleasures of just trolling the internet till you find things. Sorry, it has to do its little thing. This is, what you're asking about is something that we found in the archive in the New York Public Library. And this is Barrett Browning's original pencil sketch of Flush. And the writing that you see perpendicular just simply says, Elizabeth B. Barrett, 1843 London. So this was, you know, what if you Google, you know, Google Images will get you there eventually. You know, it's part of the serendipity of the search, right? Christine and I started looking for images in the winter. You know, you work for an hour a day, you have fun, you find things, and then this just popped up and unexpectedly. And of course, as we all know, one of the challenges of having collections dispersed is you can find things anywhere. So this was searching the New York Public Library records and other Barrett Browning related archives. Like there could be something buried in Texas that I have no knowledge of, but we were delighted to find this.
Well, can I just thank you on behalf of myself and also Jane Goldman, who I believe is hiding away somewhere in this room. I know it's not like her to hide away, but she is here somewhere.
Oh. Yeah.
Because I think, Jane, we're going to have to find a way to include this image in our Cambridge edition.
There's also another one in one of the letters where she says it's a portrait of Flush. It's another little cute drawing, and it's actually a self-portrait.
Which of course we tried to demonstrate. Just before, sorry to interrupt, in case it helps, what you probably can't see is the acquisition number that's stamped on it. If you're writing, it is 65 B as in Bob 2390. But we tried to, if I can just go back, yes, the extent to which they look alike, which we tried to show. And now, of course, this is not Flush that you see on the left. This is stock, exactly. But you know, we wondered at first, you know, why choose this particular portrait of Barrett Browning? But it's because she looks so much like any Cocker Spaniel. So yeah, I again, part of the playfulness of the text, not, what would you say, Marie-Christine, not to disparage Barrett Browning, but to mock the reader's desire. I mean, how many people say, you know, people look like their pets? And I think that in the many descriptions of Flush, Woolf is again trying to shall we say, derail the typical way in which we read and the way that we want things to make sense, the way that we want to overload text with our emotions, our sentimentality, rather than taking, you know, an astringent, snap out of it kind of approach to these things.
Yeah, Lesley, that's wonderful. And that's really what she's doing by messing with these portraits. I mean, there is actually a photograph of Flush that Trekkie Parsons uses in the, I think it's the 1983 republication of Flush. So she slaps an actual photograph of Flush as a puppy on the front of Woolf's novel. And I think that's so diminishing, because the whole point is Woolf avoids giving photographic evidence of the lived Flush because, you know, in my view, Pinker is the star. and you know, it's kind of elevating and making you really understand as a reader that you have to pay attention to illustration. And that, you know, you can't just flick past it in a biography and think that it's there to kind of somehow affirm a lived reality. Yeah, anyway, I'll be quiet, but thank you so much. Have you put your paper up so we can all read it?
Well, we have not, but that's not because we're hiding it. It's because we are actually in the middle of reading the proofs for our book. And so our paper doesn't have any of the notes or that in it. And we were a little embarrassed by that. So that's why we haven't shared it. If I could just make one more point about the illustrations that you mentioned, I think that also obtains to the Vanessa Bell illustrations that are provided, because they,
yes, surely, yeah,
they are part of that, you know, that fantasy of the Sleeping Beauty rescued by the prince and whisked off to the palace in Italy. They're charming.
Yes, and because, if I can interrupt you, Lesley, this is how we do, Lesley and I, when we write, because the photos are sweet. They are part and charming. They are part of the tale's satiric warning against love, so-called love, and the patriarchal forces that made the loving mistress transform her dog into a lapdog and herself into a lapdog, and how this legend that everybody loves and keeps talking about only makes sense if it is placed at the intersection of discourses of patriarchy, class, gender, race, etc. Because we didn't have time, but race and empire is everywhere in Flush as well. So the only way you can love Barry Brown is if you don't read her and you love empire and race and gender and all of those. And who can't love a puppy?
Laura.
Yeah, this was my hand up, not because I can't love a puppy, but because I wanted to kind of move the conversation further. I basically have a very simple question, but trying to bring the papers into conversation. So I was wondering how Lesley and Marie-Christine's notion of satire and Luca Pinelli's notion of zigzagging arguments, Woolf's zigzagging arguments, and Marie's idea about her non-dualistic view of experience, how they relate to Woolf's feminism, and particularly to that page, those few pages in Three Guineas where she says, okay, feminism, you don't like the word, let's just tear up the word and make something new, right? And I think it's exactly at the intersection of zigzagging arguments, refusal of binaries, and satire that she addresses the notion of feminism there. And I was just wondering what thoughts you have on that.
That is a great question. I'm going to let the two others answer, though. Hello, by the way, I saw you in Leuven Laura.
Yes, I recognize you from the conference I organized. It's really nice to see you again, and I'm really excited about reading your book. It's in a good dialogue with the project that I'm starting next fall. So we'll be in touch.
So if I may answer the question, I think we've come to the same kind of concept in some way with using different names, or the same kind of strategy that we find in Woolf's works. So I think that actually the paper that I mentioned by Valérie Favre is a very good summary of her of Woolf's feminism and this kind of textual strategy that she uses. Although the paper is only on room 1 zone, so maybe for 3 guineas there's something else going on. I haven't got to that point of my thesis yet, so I'm not really sure I can address that part of Woolf's feminism, so 3 guineas onwards. But in a room 1 zone, it's quite clear that she's, or the narrator is, embodying different strands of feminist theory, as I tried to say, and the textual strategy that you see there is very much trying to make you lose your bearings in the text. So it's kind of hard to say, this is what this is the kind of theory we should derive from the text, and this is actually what she doesn't agree with. So I think it's I think the answer to the question is just it's basically Valérie's paper, right? Isn't it, Marie? I'm just basically summarizing her position, but I think it's such good work, and I really recommend reading it if you haven't done so yet.
Could I also add that this very discerning comment that our papers are using the same, are discerning the strategies that are embedded within Woolf's texts. We call them by different names, but I think it could be argued that this is very much at the heart of Woolf's feminism, and it's partly, one would suggest, what she struggles with until Jacob's Room, and that is how to have these texts that are doing the zigzag, if you will, or what Melba Cuddy-Keene calls turn and turn about, and that is simply insisting on there being not one method or not one style. And so whether it's a text like The Lighthouse that has 2 modes of writing, or The Waves that insistently juxtaposes the interludes, I think that I would like to suggest whether the text is satirical or not, it is always this paratactic, strategic kind of writing that Woolf uses to put to throw the reader off guard, to insist that the reader not be lulled into comfort. The comfort, that kind of cozy comfort of reading Dickens, for example, which is not to disparage Dickens, because as Woolf's essay on David Copperfield demonstrates, there's a lot more going on. But that way that you just like to, cozy up to a book, settle into it, and just let the book take you wherever. And Woolf's stringent tactics are demanding much more from the reader than that. And in fact, I would suggest that that's why she develops these wonderful narrators, stupid as a bag of hammers, some of them. I'm thinking of the biographer in Orlando, but is always saying, really, you want to read like this? You want this person? And may I say, with all due respect, this guy, showing you what to think. The texts work against that complacency very effectively and in very different registers.
Marie, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to return to Laura's question. It's such a great question. I mean, what I find absolutely fascinating, frustrating sometimes, but so productive, is like that Woolf is at once, as I said, like constantly accommodating contradictions and opposing forces, but also she's really radical. And in 3 Guineas, she is, I think that her kind of let's burn the word feminism, blah, blah, blah. I think it's because, in a way, just like what had happened with the League of Nations and stuff, it just wasn't radical enough for her. It wasn't radical enough, and it wasn't all encompassing enough, because there is also this critique of imperialism, capitalism, blah, blah, blah. And I think that she wasn't seeing this happening I mean, yet in the feminism of her time. I mean, I may be wrong because I'm not a historian, so I'm not a specialist of that. But I think she was looking for something more radical and more encompassing, and that's the reason why. But I thought also, saying she's I mean, as much as she says that anger, you know, shouldn't have any place in creation and stuff, I think she likes to be angry. She likes to burn things down, and I like her for that. Yeah. That would be my response, Laura. I'm not sure it adds anything to the conversation.
That's such a brilliant answer. Yeah, I like that she wanted things to be more radical and more interconnected.
Yeah, that's the thing, because it's all about, because I think it's why she accommodates like radicalism and nuance, right? It's because she sees the big picture, and she's a terribly efficient political thinker. So I think that's what it is. Can I just take this opportunity to ask Luca about something? Luca, I was really interested about like I took the liberty of like taking a snapshot of that slide and others as well. In the one of the works you cited, there was this quote so about how Woolf conceptualizes the desire to fill the void with a literary language that was still observant of male symbolic order. I don't really know what my question is, that's the problem, but I'm just so interested in this thing, like where sometimes people seem to place Woolf very much on the male side of the spectrum of the symbolic order, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes it's very much the opposite. So like she either has to be very maternal or very paternal. And I had that in one of my chapters where basically about between the acts, like I had many psychoanalytic critics saying, this is the failure of the paternal metaphor, and critics saying completely the opposite, like this is you know, the return of the mother and of the chaotic mother. And I was like, okay, you know what I mean, you need to decide, guys. It's not working. How about both, maybe? So I don't know, could you talk a bit more about like that quote that you included, and like what's behind it, what's the thinking behind it, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely, makes absolutely sense. So this is a quote from Elisa, who's also here, I think, and it's based on the memos that these feminists wrote during these meetings where they discussed some of Woolf's novels that they were reading. And well, they basically thought that she wasn't looking for a kind of non-patriarchal or anti-patriarchal language in the way that some other feminist writers were doing, like Gertrude Stein, for instance. But I think also in France, for instance, Monique Wittig, I don't think she'd been translated into Italian, so that's why she's not mentioned, she was not read. But you know, the kind of use of language that Gertrude Stein makes in some of her writings is quite far from the language of Woolf, I think. So that there's no interruptions or I don't know, like attempts to break down the language in a very yeah, it was also a problem of translation, obviously, as Elisa says. I don't know if you want to jump in and say something more about that. Obviously, the translation that they read of Woolf's works were very much flawed and okay. And they well, for instance, with To the Lighthouse, we have a very different representation of Mrs. Ramsay, for instance. So you basically see her as just a housewife organizing these dinner parties that don't really serve any kind of purpose, whereas in Woolf's text it's a bit more nuanced than that. So well, yeah, Elisa can address that question better than me, probably, because she wrote the paper. She actually looked at the memos. So Elisa, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I'm sorry I have to enter the conversation, but yeah, Luca was right. I mean, of course, Gertrude Stein was much more experimental, and she had this sense of suspended sentences. What they like was that idea of not needing to fill the sentence, to complete the sentence. This incompleteness of sentences was something they were looking for, because they said, well, maybe that might be a way to say, you know what, I'm not beginning and end, I'm not closed in a shape, I may be something which I cannot define even myself. And they were really trying to get out of the idea of a woman can be either the artist with no son, with no children, or the mother and the wife, the perfect mother and wife. But as Luca was saying, yes, it was also mainly a problem of translation. They read To the Lighthouse in a translation where, for instance, many times Mrs. Ramsay is called the wife, la moglie, instead of Mrs. Ramsay, or Mr. Ramsay is called il capofamiglia, so the master of the house, instead of the father. So in the Italian version, a very patriarchal language or patriarchal references are used. And so, of course, when they were reading the novel, they found the typical patriarchal references they were trying to fight. So they didn't like it. And in fact, they said Woolf is a much better essayist than a novelist. She is much more successful as an essayist than as a novelist, because they read novels in translation. When a feminist retranslated To the Lighthouse, their ideas changed completely, and To the Lighthouse became emblematic of a feminist turn in female writing. So you see, translation has effects.
Well, it looks like we are just about out of time. But I want to thank everybody again for a terrific panel. Can we have a round of applause for our terrific panelists? So thank you all again, and we will all be seeing each other in other panels very shortly. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these papers. They were so great.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.